A man entered and asked if the store still honored the forgetting ritual. The bell above the door chimed once, thin and metallic, then settled back into silence. Daniel looked up from the counter automatically. The store was quiet the way it always was after midnight. Fluorescent lights humming, refrigeration units exhaling a steady breath of cold air, the faint smell of cardboard and stale coffee lingering near the register. Outside, the street was empty. The man stood just inside the door. Mid-40s, maybe, gray coat, damp at the shoulders like he'd walked through mist. His hair was flattened slightly to one side, and there was something careful about the way he held himself, as if sudden movements might cause something to spill. Daniel blinked. "The what ritual?" he asked. "The forgetting ritual," the man repeated politely. His voice was calm, not joking, not embarrassed, just patient. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "I think you've got the wrong place," he said. The man glanced around the store. The shelves were narrow and tall, stacked with paperback novels, snacks, and small travel supplies. An odd hybrid store that had evolved over years of quiet night traffic. The back wall held a humming refrigerator of drinks. A rotating rack of bookmarks squeaked softly whenever the air conditioner kicked on. The man's eyes lingered on the aisle marked used books. Then he looked back at Daniel. "No," he said gently. "This is the place." Daniel forced a small laugh. "Sorry, we don't do rituals here. Just coffee and paperbacks." The man didn't argue. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a minor misunderstanding. Then he walked deeper into the store. The bell above the door gave a soft metallic tremble behind him as it settled completely. Daniel watched him move between the shelves. His footsteps were quiet on the tile. For a few minutes, the only sound in the store was the hum of the refrigerators and the faint crackle of fluorescent lighting. Daniel looked back down at the crossword he'd been filling out. 5-letter word for absence. He stared at the empty boxes. A few seconds passed. Then the lights flickered. Just once. The kind of quick electrical blink that happened in old buildings. Daniel glanced up. The man was standing at the end of the used books aisle, looking at something on the wall. Daniel frowned. There wasn't anything on that wall. Just a blank stretch of pale paint. But the man seemed to be studying it carefully. After a moment he turned and walked back toward the counter. Daniel noticed something odd. The man's reflection in the glass refrigerator doors lagged half a step behind him. Not much, just enough to make Daniel blink again. When he looked a second time, it matched perfectly. The man reached the counter. "I understand," he said kindly. "It's easy to forget." Daniel felt a small knot tighten somewhere behind his ribs. "Forget what?" "That you perform it." Daniel frowned. "I don't." The man studied Daniel's face. For a moment there was a strange sadness in his expression. "You probably say that every time," he said. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, then stopped, because the crossword puzzle in front of him was already finished. Every square filled. His handwriting. He didn't remember finishing it. He stared at the page. 5-letter word for absence. Erase. He felt a small ripple of unease. "How long have you been in here?" Daniel asked. The man glanced at the wall clock. "About 20 minutes. Daniel's stomach tightened. "No, you haven't." The man tilted his head slightly. "You don't remember the conversation?" "What conversation?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the counter. A small brass token. It was worn smooth around the edges. Stamped into its surface were the words, "One memory." Daniel stared at it. "I've never seen that before." "You gave it to me last time," the man said. The refrigerators hummed louder for a moment, like a long exhale. Daniel rubbed his temples. "I think you should leave." The man nodded slowly. "That's usually the point where you notice the mirror." Daniel felt a small prickle crawl across the back of his neck. "What mirror?" The man gestured toward the aisle behind Daniel. The used books aisle. Daniel turned. At the far end of the aisle, where he was certain there had been only a blank wall earlier, There was now a narrow standing mirror. It was tall and old-looking, framed in dark wood that didn't match anything else in the store. Daniel stood slowly. "I didn't put that there." "No," the man said. "You moved it earlier." Daniel walked toward it. The lights flickered again as he passed beneath them. Each step echoed slightly louder than it should have on the tile floor. When he reached the mirror, he stopped. His reflection looked normal. Tired eyes. Store uniform. The faint crease between his eyebrows he'd developed after years of night shifts. But something behind him in the reflection made his chest tighten. The aisle looked longer. Much longer than it actually was. Daniel glanced over his shoulder. The aisle behind him looked normal. 10 feet of shelves. Then the counter. But in the mirror, the shelves stretched far back into dimness. Rows and rows of books disappearing into shadow. Daniel turned back to the reflection. The man had followed him halfway down the aisle. In the mirror, though, the man stood much closer. Close enough that Daniel could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "You're starting to remember," the man said softly. Daniel swallowed. "I've never done this before." The man nodded again. "That's what the ritual is for." Daniel turned to face him. "What ritual?" The man gestured gently toward the mirror. "You take the memory someone wants removed," he said. "You pull it out of them." Daniel laughed once, short, disbelieving. "That's not possible." "Then explain the room behind the mirror." Daniel turned again. In the reflection, something moved deep within the endless shelves. Not a person. More like a shifting gap in the rows. Like a missing space where something had been taken. His heart began to beat faster. "What happens to the memories?" Daniel asked quietly. The man's voice was careful. "You keep them." Daniel felt the words settle somewhere cold. "What do you mean, keep them?" "You don't erase them," the man said. "You carry them instead." The lights flickered again. Longer this time. For a second the store went dim. When the lights returned, Daniel was standing behind the counter again. He didn't remember walking back. The brass token sat in front of him. The man stood across from the counter. Waiting. Daniel felt dizzy. "How many times?" he said slowly. "Have you come here?" The man hesitated, then answered honestly. 7. Daniel's throat tightened. "Why do you keep coming back?" The man looked down at the counter. "Because it doesn't work." Daniel felt a slow cold spreading through him. "What doesn't work?" "The forgetting." The man looked up. "You take the memory away from me," he said. "But the next day, I remember that I came here." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Daniel stared at the brass token, then at the mirror at the end of the aisle. In its reflection, the shelves behind the glass were crowded now. Not with books, with shadows, shapes, thousands of thin, stacked impressions. Memories, not his, but carried somewhere inside him. He felt something shift inside his mind. A door opening. Suddenly, he remembered the man sitting in a chair beside the mirror. 7 different nights. 7 different confessions. Car accident. A hospital room. A child's face going still. Daniel had taken that memory, pulled it away like thread from fabric, placed it somewhere behind the mirror, and afterward, he had forgotten doing it, because otherwise he would remember everything. The man watched his expression carefully. "You see it now," he said. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes." His voice sounded distant. The man exhaled with relief. "So we can do it again." Daniel looked toward the mirror, toward the endless shelves of borrowed memories, toward the one that belonged to this man, still sitting there, still waiting, unforgotten. Daniel felt a deep, quiet exhaustion settle into his bones. He looked back at the man. "No," he said gently. The man's relief vanished. "Why not?" Daniel slid the brass token across the counter. "Because now I remember why it never works." The man's voice trembled slightly. "Why?" Daniel glanced toward the mirror again, toward the memory that refused to disappear, then back at the man. "Because it's not your memory anymore," he said. The refrigerators hummed. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Outside, the street remained empty. The man stared at him. "But if you're keeping it," he said slowly, "why do I still remember?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked down at the counter, at the crossword puzzle. 5-letter word for absence. Erase. Except now, 2 of the letters were missing. He didn't remember erasing them. Daniel looked back up at the man, and for the first time he realized something that made the store feel suddenly impossibly quiet. The man looked familiar, not from 7 visits, from much longer. Daniel's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Because," he said slowly, "it wasn't your memory to begin with." The store's receipt printer began printing coordinates, none of which exist on any map. The sound was wrong first. A thin mechanical whir from the counter behind Daniel, sharp against the quiet hum of the refrigerators. The receipt printer only activated when something rang through the register, and Daniel was certain he hadn't touched it in the last 20 minutes. He turned slowly in his chair. The strip of paper curled out from the printer like a pale tongue. Where, click, another line printed. Daniel stood and walked behind the counter. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, their greenish glow reflected in the glass refrigerator doors along the back wall. The store was empty. Outside, the parking lot sat under a dull sodium street lamp that made the asphalt look like wet stone. He tore the receipt free. Instead of items or prices, the paper held a single line. 37.9482 degrees north, 142.0175 degrees west. Daniel frowned. He flipped the paper over. Blank. The printer whirred again. A second receipt slid out. Where, click. He watched it print. 12.3901 degrees south, 76.8942 degrees west. More coordinates. Daniel let out a small breath through his nose. The machine probably glitched. The store systems were old. Sometimes the lottery terminal printed nonsense when the network dropped. Still, he unplugged the receipt printer. The humming refrigerators filled the quiet again. Daniel folded the slips of paper and dropped them into the trash beneath the counter. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The air conditioner sighed softly through its vents. A fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead like an insect trapped in glass. Daniel picked up his phone and typed the first coordinates into a map app. The screen paused, then returned an empty ocean. No location found. He tried the second. The map zoomed toward the coast of South America, then halted with the same message. Location unavailable. Daniel frowned. That wasn't how coordinates usually behaved. Even if they landed in the middle of nowhere, the map still showed terrain. He stared at the numbers again. Something about them felt oddly familiar. Not recognizable exactly. More like a half-remembered address or a place you once passed through without realizing you'd need to remember it later. The printer whirred again. Daniel looked up sharply. The power cable still lay unplugged on the counter. But the receipt printer was moving. Where, click. A new strip of paper curled out slowly. Daniel stepped closer. The fluorescent light flickered again as the numbers appeared. 46.1229 degrees north, 91.7304 degrees east. He stared at the cable, still unplugged. A thin prickle ran along the back of his neck. The refrigerators hummed louder for a moment, like a long breath drawn through teeth. Daniel reached toward the printer and pulled the receipt free. The paper felt warm. Behind him, something shifted softly. He turned. The aisles looked longer. It wasn't obvious at first. Just a slight stretching of perspective. The rows of snack shelves seemed to extend farther toward the back wall than they should have. Daniel stepped out from behind the counter. The tile floor felt colder than before. He walked halfway down the main aisle. Everything looked normal. Candy bars, instant noodles, a crooked rack of postcards that no one ever bought. But the distance between the shelves felt subtly wrong, like the space between steps had stretched. Daniel turned back toward the counter. It looked farther away too. Not much, just enough to make his stomach tighten. The printer whirred again. From here the sound echoed faintly down the aisle. Daniel walked back toward the counter. Another receipt waited in the tray. 29.5502 degrees north. 95.0970 degrees west. He stared at it. That one felt different. The familiarity sharpened. Not a memory exactly. More like a feeling. Like hearing a song you almost know. He checked it on the map. The app hesitated again. Then displayed nothing. Location unavailable. Daniel rubbed his eyes. He hadn't slept well the night before. Maybe the coordinates were real and the app was just malfunctioning. Behind him, the refrigerators hummed again. The glass doors reflected the aisle. Daniel glanced toward them. His reflection lagged half a second behind his movement. He turned his head. In the reflection, his head turned slightly later. Daniel stared. When he moved again, the reflection matched perfectly. He exhaled slowly. "Okay," he murmured to himself. The printer whirred. Another receipt. He didn't even look at the cable anymore. The machine printed a long strip this time. Numbers spilled down the page. 51.2230 degrees north. 13.8725 degrees east. 34.7109 degrees south. 150.9831 degrees east. 29.5502 degrees north. 95.0970 degrees west. Daniel froze. That last one repeated. The same coordinates as before. A small chill slid through him. He typed them again into the map. Same result. Location unavailable. But the sense of recognition deepened. He felt certain he had been there. Not recently. Long ago. Or maybe often. He turned slowly toward the aisles. They looked longer again. The back wall seemed slightly farther away than before. The fluorescent lights above flickered one by one down the row like distant lightning. Daniel walked down the aisle. His footsteps echoed softly. Halfway down, he stopped. The aisle should have ended. But it didn't. The shelves continued. Another row of snacks. Another rack of magazines. Then another. The air smelled faintly different here, cooler, with the dry scent of cardboard and dust. Daniel turned back. The counter was barely visible now. The refrigerators looked smaller. "Hello?" he called softly. His voice didn't echo the way it should have. It seemed to fold back into the aisles. Behind him, the receipt printer whirred again. Even from this distance, he could hear it. Click. Daniel walked farther. The shelves grew stranger the deeper he went. Items he didn't recognize. Cans with unfamiliar labels. Maps folded into plastic sleeves. All of them marked with coordinates. The numbers looked like the ones the printer had been producing. He picked up one of the maps. The paper was yellowed. In the center was a small circle drawn in red ink. Coordinates written beneath it. 29.5502 degrees north. 95.0970 degrees west. Daniel's throat tightened. He knew that number now. He just didn't know why. Behind him, something shifted. Daniel turned. The aisle behind him stretched impossibly long. Far in the distance, he could see the faint green glow of the counter lights. The printer whirred again. But the sound came from somewhere closer now. Daniel turned back. At the end of the aisle, where the back wall should have been, there was a narrow door. It hadn't been there before. The door was metal, painted the same pale color as the store walls. A small receipt was taped to it. Daniel approached slowly. The fluorescent lights above buzzed louder as he stepped closer. He pulled the receipt free. Only one line was printed. 29.5502 degrees north. 95.0970 degrees west. Below it, a second line had been added. Not printed. Written. In handwriting Daniel recognized immediately. His own. The message read, "You left something here." Daniel felt the memory arrive slowly. Not like a sudden realization. More like a tide rising. Parking lot. A building that looked like this one. Except it wasn't a store. It was a coordinate, a place that existed between locations, a place people forgot. And he had worked here before, for a very long time. Daniel looked back down the endless aisle. Somewhere behind him, the receipt printer whirred again, printing more coordinates, more places that shouldn't exist, more places waiting to be remembered. Daniel stared at the door, at the numbers written beneath it, and slowly, with the quiet certainty of someone recognizing their own address after years away, he realized the coordinates weren't pointing somewhere else. They were pointing here,